Good morning, everybody. Today is Thursday, August 18th, 2022. I am man with the windows open. It's very nice out today, and got the windows open, getting some fresh air. Might get a little hotter later in the day, but we'll deal with that when it comes. But today, I'm feeling good. I had a good day yesterday. Didn't have as much energy, sleep issues as I was having earlier in the week, so that feels really good. And and so we're going to be doing some more exercism. I believe today we're going to look at the docs example. Documentation Elixir is a really good first-class citizen tool. Works really, really well. There are two module attributes commonly used to document your code. At module doc for documenting a module, and at doc for documenting a function that follows the attribute. The at module doc attribute usually appears on the first line of the module, and the at doc attribute usually appears right before a function definition or the function's type spec if it has one. The documentation is commonly written in a multi-line string using the here doc syntax. Elixir documentation is written in Markdown. So here you go. So we've got this string module, and we've got this module doc at the top, using triple quotes and then presenting the documentation there. Strings in Elixir are UTF encoded binaries, period. I would take special note of like the capitalization of things here. So like typically you want your documentation to be a complete string. So that's like a capital letter at the front, punctuation at the end. I would avoid, but yeah. Anyway, that's the style I recommend. That's the style you'll typically see in the formal standard libraries. And as you can see here, you can use Markdown. So you can use pound examples, and then you have this inline IEX syntax, and this is where you can basically present what your function looks like in practice. So in this case, string.upcase takes a string ABCD and returns capital ABCD. The really cool thing with this example format is there's tooling in the unit test system where you can unit test these examples. So you can kind of make sure that they are kept up to date as the functions change. And that's really powerful. This is this is the documentation, and then the typical tool that people use to generate documentation is called Xdoc. And so you can find more on documentation here in the Learn More section. There's a whole section inside the Elixir documentation on writing documentation and what things you should look for, how to mark things as deprecated, and all kinds of other recommendations. Talk about the doc test stuff. And then there's a page on documentation at Elixir School, which is at elixirschool.com, which is another great resource for checking things out. And those go over similar kind of concepts. Highly recommend it. You check those out. So today we're going to be working on City Office. And okay, so City Office does two concepts, docs and Typespecs. So let's take a look at Typespecs. Elixir is a dynamically typed language, which means it doesn't provide compile time type checks. Still, type specifications can be used as a form of documentation. A type specification can be added to a function using the @spec module attribute right before the function definition. @spec is followed by the function name and a list of all the arguments' types, in parentheses, separated by commas. The type of the return value is separated from the function's arguments with a double colon. So here you can see we've got a function called longer than, takes in two arguments, variable named string and length. Of course, because they're called string and length, it doesn't hint the compiler or anything. And then it's going to do some work with it, basically returning a boolean if string length is greater than the passed in length. And so the way you document this is with @spec, the function name, and then the types. And so for strings, you would recommend it to use the string.t type. And then for length, you can use non-negative integer. And then you can see : and this is going to be the return type. There's lots of different types in Elixir. There's probably a link to the type specs here. And you can kind of learn all about the built-in ones and how you can be more specific about them. So like when you're like for integer, for example, you can just say integer, but if you want to, you can be more precise and say non-negative integer or positive integer or things like that. Later when you're doing type specs for incoming maps, for example, you could be more expressive about this map has to have this key when it comes in. And so, so most commonly used types include Boolean, string.t, which is a alias to binary, because strings are just binary in Elixir. But I think string.t is more specific. But if you're using some other tools, you may see it use the term binary in its place. You got list, and then you've got any. So if you don't want to be expressive about the type, you can say any. Some types can also be parameterized. For example, list integer is a list of integers. Literal values can also be used as types. So a union of types can be written using the pipe, for example, basically saying that this will accept either an integer or a error atom, meaning either integer or error atom. Full list of types can be found in the Typespecs section in the official documentation. Naming arguments. Arguments in the type spec could also be named, which is useful for distinguishing multiple arguments of the same type. The argument name followed by a double colon goes before the argument. So you can, when defining your type, just put the actual type itself, so string and non-negative integer. But if you want, you can be more explicit by giving a name. So in this case, if you've got a function called toHex that takes in multiple integers, you can be specific and say the first argument should be referenced as hue, saturation, and lightness. And then this can help with some documentation, some code completion, I believe, as well. And then if you ever want to do a I was going to say if you ever wanted to do a guard clause on a type. I don't think you can do a guard clause on a type per se, though. I could be off on that. Then finally, we've got custom types. Typespecs are not limited to just the built-in types. Custom types can be defined using the add_type module attribute. A custom type definition starts with the type's name, followed by a double colon, and then the type itself. So here, for example, we have defined a custom type called color. It is going to be a tuple value, a tuple with 3 values, integer, integer, and integer. The first representing hue, then saturation, then lightness. Then later, when you're actually building your spec for a specific function, you can just say this is going to accept the color type, and the compiler will do the substitutions needed for that. And yeah, and that's Typespecs. So documentation, Typespecs. So Typespecs come into play, I guess, first for documentation purposes. It lets you be explicit about the function you are writing and the expected inputs and outputs. And then tools like Xdoc will generate more descriptive documentation if you have a type spec for that function. Now, the other tool that'll come into play with Typespecs is a tool called Dialyzer. And what Dialyzer does, and we may get into Dialyzer later. I want to just take a quick peek to see if I don't see it. No. So Dialyzer is not part of Elixir itself. It's like a tool that's built on top of the beam, basically. And what Dialyzer can do is it can read your type specs and then read your code and show you how you are using your code that is not honoring the type spec. And so this is not during the runtime. This is This is like an external tool that you run on your code base. But if you are working on a more mature Elixir app, you probably will be running into Dialyzer a lot. And it helps you verify your type specs. Dialyzer is a whole project in and of itself, so maybe we'll get into that someday. For now, our type specs are mostly going to be written to help the documentation angle for the Elixir Exercism track. So, all right. So our example today is going to be called City Office. You have been working in the city office for a while, and you have developed a set of tools that speed your day-to-day work, for example, with filling out forms. Now a new colleague is joining you and you realized your tools might not be self-explanatory. There are a lot of weird conventions in your office, like always filling out forms with uppercase letters and avoiding leaving fields empty. You decide to write some documentation so that it's easier for your new colleague to hop right in and start using your tools. Well, there we go. Okay, so we're going to download our example locally, and we'll open it up with VS Code. And so we'll open up our main library, we'll open up the test file, and then we'll open up the README. Can I... No. I was going to see if I could split it. Yeah, there you go. Alright. We're going to try something new today. I don't know how well this is going to work, but we're going to keep our test up here, because I don't think our tests are going to be... Because our tests are typically not that interesting. Well, maybe we should put... you know what, we'll put the README up here. And then... we'll put the test file down here. I think that'll make more sense. Alright, so this will give us a little bit more space. Cool. Alrighty, let's see here. So, step 1, where are you? Document the purpose of the forms tools. Add documentation to the form module that describes its purpose. It should read a collection of loosely related functions helpful for filling out various forms at the city office. The joys of having my window open, of course, is the rattly, I don't know, cart that people are using. Okay, so we're going to open up this with the module doc, and we're going to paste in the description. I'm going to take a special note to share an extension that I use often, which is called rewrap. So that lets me hard wrap strings in my editor. So that previously was a long string, and it was kind of like soft wrapping in my editor. But I want this to be kind of like rule of 80 for committing purposes, so I'll just do that. And that's the module doc. And how are they testing the module doc? So they've introduced some new macros. Interesting. So they've, if you're reading this test suite against some insight, please be advised it's somewhat unusual. Don't worry if you don't understand this test suite, as it's strange. We've had to use some advanced features to write assertions about docs and type specs. You wouldn't normally write assertions for that in typical code base. We're doing it here strictly for educational purposes. I like that. So yeah, so they've built some stuff, and so now they're going to have some tests. Test the form module has expected module doc. Interesting. I've never seen that before. So let's test a cursor and see how this goes. So this is not liking my my wrapping. All right, in that case, I will turn off my wrapping so it can pass. In production, I'd wrap it, but that's me. All right, cool. So that was number 1. Number 2, document filling out fields with blank values. Add documentation and a type spec for the forms.blanks function. The documentation should read generates a string for a given length. Okay. So we'll say at doc, and we'll paste that in. Generates a string of a given length. So this is another norm that you should follow. Is typically when you're writing documentation, the first line should be a very terse, description of the function, like a one-liner, and then if you want, you can provide more detail in like a second line. And the reason you do that is because you'll get it's used in the rendered HTML documentation, like it knows to kind of cherry pick the first sentence when it needs to show a terse summary of the of the documentation. So yeah, just follow that when you're doing your stuff. All right. So that was described. Let me see if this passes. Oh, I'd expect to have a type spec. Add filling out forms with like that. Add documentation. The type spec should explain that the function accepts a single argument, a non-negative integer, which returns a string. Okay. So you can see here in my editor, because I am using, I believe, the Elixir LS extension, which is short for language server. You'll see it kind of like skips a line. So this is line 15, which is an empty line. And then line 16 is the start of defined letters. But it puts in this like spec, but it's not really there. This is kind of to show you what the dialyzer system would kind of infer, given that there's no spec. And you can, in fact, like click it, and it will create the text version of that spec. And then when you hit save, you can see it gets rid of the kind of temporary one because you have a legit one. And I'm going to move the spec to below. I think that's what they wanted, right? Did they? Let's see here. A type spec. Right before the function definition, spec is followed by the function name. Yeah, you want spec close to the function. Yeah, you definitely don't want it on top. All right, so this is what it gave me. I'm gonna say that this does take in a non-negative integer, but instead of binary, I'm gonna be more expressive and just say string, and we'll see how that, if the compiler likes that or the test likes that. Cool. Return the string. That looks good. Alrighty, number 3. Document splitting values into a list of uppercase letters. Add documentation and typespec to the form.letters function. Documentation should read. So I'm going to say at doc. And then I'm going to say at spec letters. So what does this return? The type spec should explain that the function accepts a single argument, a string, and returns a list of strings. Okay. So this takes in a string and returns a list of string. Yeah, and that, I'm going to run the test suite because I'm curious if it'll pass. Because I am using I'm not using the, oh, what don't you like? Oh, I didn't have the whole doc. Okay. We'll put that in there. Cool. Is that the only thing that failed? Yep, that's good. Okay, so you can write it as this, where it's hard bracket, and then internal, or you could do list of string. Both should be valid. All right. Number 4, document checking if a value fits a field with a max length. Add documentation and a type spec to the form.checkLength function. The documentation should read. The type spec. All right, well, let's just do the doc first. at doc. That's good. The type spec should explain at spec. Check. Length. Accepts two arguments, a string and a non-negative integer. String.type non-neg integer. And returns one of two possible values. It either returns an OK atom or a two value tuple, the first element being an error and the second a positive integer. Cool. Alrighty, let's check the test against check length. Those look good. Number 5, document different address formats for some unknown to you reason. It's a little awkward description. The city's office's internal system use two different ways for representing addresses, either as a map or a tuple. Document this fact by defining 3 custom public types. Address map with, okay. Alright, so we're going to need to do some type declaration. TYPE, please. So this is going to be called address map. And this is going to be a map with keys, street, postal code, and city. All right, let me look up the docs here for this. I want to make sure. Yeah. Required keys. I'm trying to see if you can just say, oh, does it say the types? Told the value string. Okay, so yeah, we can do that here. So we'll say street, and that'll be a string, and postal code, and that'll be a string as well, and city, that'll be a string. And then we've got address tuple. Address tuple. That'll be a tuple with 3 values. Street, postcode, and city, each value. Oh, okay. Street, string, postal code, string, and city, string. And then address can either be, okay, oh, interesting. Add type, address, and that can either be a address map or an address tuple. Format address. Custom types. Oh, okay, we do have a test for this. Cool, that passes. Number 6, document formatting of address. So we've got one more function down here. So this has got a one-liner and at doc. Okay, so we've got 2 implementations of format address. One that accepts the map version, then the other one that accepts the tuple version. Cool. So we're gonna add a spec format address. The type spec should explain that the function accepts one argument in address and returns a string. And test format address. Cool. Now we'll test the whole file. And that looks good. And all right, am I happy with this? I think I am. I think this looks pretty good. I mean, one thing you could do if you were like cleaning things up a little, like we are repeating ourselves a little by saying like the city is a string, the city is a string. You could build a type up here that says this is the city type, this is the postal code type, so that way you're not repeating yourself as much. But I'm not going to do that because it hasn't asked me to do that, and I don't know. It seems a little extra. I don't really need it. All right. Cool. Let's submit this and see what the internet has to say about my solution. Your solution looks great. Oh, thank you very much. Check out some of the community solutions. So one difference you'll see here is that in their types, like .t, they don't use the parentheses there. And I think that's like a formatter thing. If I were to take this off, yeah, like that's just something my formatter adds that I've just become accustomed to. Maybe Credo might complain too if it's not there, but technically you don't need it. It's more of a fashion statement than anything. Cool. Yeah, this looks all pretty standard. Not seeing anything major that I would want to change. Okay. It's interesting. The preview does not show the documentation, but when you click into it, the documentation is there. And that's a little awkward when you're looking for the documentation solution. But so be it. All right. So with all that said, we're going to mark it as our iteration solution as complete. We're going to publish it. And we have learned 2 new concepts, documentation and Typespecs. I'm a big documentation nerd, always trying to get better at docs. It is an ongoing journey. Cool. So that is... Oh, look, why is it green? Oh, you've mastered docs. Oh, look at that. I've never mastered a concept before. Oh, that's so exciting. I get it outlined. Mastered. That's exciting. Cool. So yeah, that's it for today. I want to thank you for joining me. Hopefully you learned something. And if you have any questions or feedback, let me know. Other than that, I will see you again tomorrow. Have a nice day and be good to people. Yeah.